Just who exactly is an Asian? Obviously, someone native to the continent of Asia. Video over, everyone go home. Okay, in all seriousness, the label of Asian doesn't really make sense. What started off as a Greek term referring to those from Anatolia and the Near East has now evolved in American vernacular to almost exclusively refer to people of East or Southeast Asian descent, and as I discussed in my continents video, Asia isn't so much a single continent from a cultural or geographic perspective, as for tens of thousands of years the gargantuan landmass was largely divided between East and West, and even then, Europe is considered separate from the rest, sort of just because people say it is based on historic and cultural reasons. A lot of people, especially South Asians, are really confused at the American usage of the word Asian, since in American English vocabulary, Chinese, Filipinos, Thai are all Asian, but Bengalis, Sri Lankans, and Nepalis are often just called Indian because the common vernacular that develops in a society is usually based on the most simplistic meanings possible, although I do believe this is changing quickly, and to our credit, we're not the only ones who do this, as in Singapore, so-called Indian Singaporeans, the country's third largest racial group, are actually descended not only from Indians, but also Sri Lankans, Bengalis, Nepalis, and Pakistanis. Again, this is just simplified vernacular to try and understand humanity. It doesn't mean anyone's stupid or ignorant just because they don't know the facts. Asian was used in the US as a synonym for East and Southeast Asians because these were, of course, some of the first Asian immigrants that arrived in the US in large numbers, with Chinese working on the railroads and mines in the West, while large numbers of Japanese and Filipinos arrived in Hawaii, and Oriental was also used, which is sort of frowned upon in certain circles, but actually makes more sense since it just means Easterners. So keep in mind, when I use the term Asian in the title, I'm actually referring to the Eastern Eurasian racial group, although from a geographic perspective, Asian could refer to a Saudi, Russian, Afghani, or a multitude of others that we don't normally think of as Asian looking in the United States. Now, using the term Caucasoid already sounds strange and uncomfortable enough, but I try to avoid the other two historical racial descriptors, Mongoloid or Negroid, even more, as there's way too much baggage and connotation attached, and most people will understand a lot easier if you just use the terms Eastern Eurasian and Sub-Saharan African instead. I would define these as extended regionalized ancestral continuums, or ERAC, because obviously each ERAC group is spread out over a large area, is moderately divergent depending on the subgroup due to internal splintering and genetic drift, and hence isn't a homogeneous group as some believe, yet they still share a common source that derived from other peoples tens of thousands of years ago. Last video I did like this on the so-called Caucasian race, or what I would refer to as the Western Eurasian ancestral continuum. I put myself out there, made some sarcastic, jokey comments throughout the video, because of course I like to add at least some personality to my content, but a lot of people got upset, and I think this made it come across kinda sloppy. So in honor of the Asian master race, there will be no joking in this video whatsoever. As everyone knows, Asians hate fun. So today we'll be defining and analyzing the Eastern Eurasian race, or ancestry, that is spread out far beyond the borders of just Mongolia, the area where the archaic descriptor derives its namesake. Eastern Eurasians are genetically more disparate from Sub-Saharan Africans than Western Eurasians are, and most groups are actually closer to Australo-Melanesian peoples to the south than the latter two, strangely enough. However, the Amerindians are acknowledged to mostly be an offshoot of the Eastern Eurasian racial group, separated by 10 to 15,000 years depending on the group, with additional moderate Western Eurasian input from their time in Siberia, and because of their isolation in the American continents, they have become quite genetically distinct. I'll save an Amerindian breakdown for another video, but the Eskimo Aleut peoples of the northern fringes, including the Inuit and Aleutians, are the most similar to the Eastern Eurasians, with some still being located on the mainland of Asia today, although they have heavily intermixed with the previous Paleo-Amerindian populations and cluster more closely to them. Similar to the Caucasian grouping mentioned in the last video, some groups formerly considered a part of this Eastern Eurasian grouping include Finns, Turks, Estonians, and other Baltic peoples, even Hungarians at one point. This is because the Turkic and Uralic language families originated with Eastern Eurasian groups before spreading to Anatolia and Northern Europe, even though on average Anatolian Turks today only have around 10% Eastern Eurasian admixture, although this is highly variable, while Finns only have around 8% and Hungarians only 2%, with Eastern Eurasian haplogroups like paternal haplogroup N being nearly non-existent among ethnic Hungarians due to migration from other Central European peoples throughout their history. So in some ways, this makes even less sense than the historical classification of Caucasians, as some of these groups literally have almost no Eastern Eurasian admixture whatsoever. For continental Eastern Eurasians, that means excluding Amerindians, you can divide between three basal archaic divisions, with the main two being described as Synodont and Sundodont, basically the division between East and Southeast Asians, with the third being a highly unique and specialized subrace that is the most pronounced in the Ainu people of the Far East today, so I suppose you could call them Sinoid, Sundonoid, and Ainoid. I discussed this Ainoid component at length in my video over the ethnic origins of Japan, as the original people of Japan, the Jomon, were of this highly regionalized phenotype and gene pool that had split from other Sinoid Eurasians sometime before, and were sometimes even called Asian Caucasoids because of their phenotypic similarities to Europeans, which were more pronounced in earlier times. The Yamato, or ethnic Japanese people today, are a hybridized population of the Jomon, Yayoi, and earlier mainland Asian migrants, with phenotype being quite diverse among them, with the Ainu still having the highest degree of this Jomon component, although intermarriage with Yamato is extraordinarily common nowadays. From a genetic and cultural perspective, it's actually kind of helpful to think of northern China, Korea, and Japan as northern Europe, while southern China is analogous to southern Europe. Mainland Southeast Asia, including Vietnam, Thailand, Myanmar, and others, are analogous to the Middle East, and maritime Southeast Asia is equivalent to North Africa. Not because these aforementioned regions share cultural similarities with their twin grouping, but because it's merely a metaphor for how each region is tied to its neighbors. For instance, maritime Southeast Asians have varying degrees of ancestry from Australo and Melanesian peoples, similar to how North Africans have ancestry from sub-Saharan Africans, while the Northern Han, Koreans, and Japanese are the most quote-unquote racially pure, as they haven't had significant admixture from any other groups, similar to most Northern Europeans. Here's my map of Eastern Eurasian admixture in the Old World, which is actually quite a bit more detailed than my Western Eurasian map, as that was already a bit of a work in progress, plus I had more time to work on this one. You can see that Eastern Eurasian admixture is clearly highest in East Asia, followed by Southeast Asia, with there also being a large component in Central Asian groups, and more scattered throughout Siberia, despite being formerly widespread, as just as the Indo-European Central Asians were conquered by the Mongols and Turks, the Altaic North Asians were conquered by the Slavs. The lower rates in some parts of central China are from ethnic groups like the Hui, a Chinese-speaking Muslim group with a small amount of ancestry from Persia, Arabia, or Central Asia, as well as Turkic or Mongolic groups like the Daur or Salar in Gansu and Qinghai, with Western Eurasian admixture from Central Asia. You can also see lowering rates in Austronesia as you approach the Moluccan Islands and the island of New Guinea, and at this scale, Micronesia and Polynesia aren't really visible, but if they were, then you'd be able to see that Eastern Eurasian admixture is around 60 and 75% of these groups respectively, so it is a bit strange that on the US Census and in my ethno-racial maps of the world, they're grouped together with Melanesians, Papuans, and other Oceanians, but I suppose I'll probably revise that in the future. Probably. You might find trace amounts of Eastern Eurasian admixture on the mainland of Australia from Austronesian and ancient Southeast Asian migrants, similar to how there are trace amounts of South Asian admixture as well, but it's simply not comparable to any of these previous regions. Of course, virtually the entirety of the Southeast Asian population has some small degree of ancestry from the original Australo-Melanesian inhabitants, who still exist in small pockets scattered throughout Luzon and the Philippines, with groups like the Aita or the Aslians in the interior of peninsular Malaysia, with all of these groups also having moderate to large amounts of recent Eastern Eurasian admixture as well, so it is quite difficult to classify them racially. This is very similar to the Adivasis of south-central India, who have remained relatively unmixed by the waves of migration from Western and Eastern Eurasia that have shaped the continent, with the exception of the Mundari groups, an Austroasiatic-speaking bunch in Eastern India, who are Adivasis with significant Eastern Eurasian, about 20 to 30% admixture, mostly in the paternal lineages. In other parts of eastern India, the Odia, Bengali, and Assamese have varying rates of ancestry from Southeast Asia, which has in turn spread to Sri Lanka, as the Sinhalese have ancient roots from Bengal, and the Nepalis also have admixture from Tibetans to their north, and these Indo-Aryan peoples have also heavily impacted these regions genetically as well. Lastly, in Africa, you can find trace amounts of Eastern Eurasian admixture along the coast of the mainland, but Madagascar and the Comoros Islands stand out as having been heavily saturated with ancestry from ancient Austronesian migrants, only around 14% in the Swahili-speaking Comoros, as subsequent waves of African and Middle Eastern migration has diluted this component. But in Madagascar, this is still very much apparent in the language, culture, and appearance of the islanders, varying heavily among group, but with the Asian admixture being most heavy on the eastern side and in the highlands region. Excluding South Asians, you don't really have Asian diaspora countries similar to what you have for Europeans and Sub-Saharan Africans. However, Hawaii is a good example of a region heavily impacted by Eastern Eurasian migration, either through the indigenous Polynesians or more recent Filipino, Japanese, or Chinese immigrants. And of course, Singapore in Southeast Asia is predominantly of Chinese ancestry from migrants stretching back hundreds of years. When trying to deduce and measure ancestral origins and admixture, it's very easy for some to just throw their hands up in the air and say, this is just way too complicated. But when you actually break it down, the historic patterns of migration, intermixing, and splintering that result in this genetic mosaic becomes a lot more clear, and it's interesting to think that the anthropologists of old largely got it right, except for that Hungarian thing. That makes no sense at all. So go ahead and let me know your thoughts on the Eastern Eurasian race, or ERAC, and for today's poll, let me know which of the Eastern Eurasian groups specifically you'd like to learn more about. And as always, thanks for watching everyone. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.